Hello, I'm Dr. Stephan Edwards, and this presentation is Queen Jane's Proclamation of Accession of 1553 and Gendering of the English Monarchy. This lecture was originally sponsored and hosted by the Society of Antiquaries of London in their apartments at Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, on Thursday, the 4th of April, 2024. Lectures hosted by the Society are customarily live-streamed on the Society's YouTube channel, but a construction incident nearby severed the Society's internet access for the entire day. The Society was regrettably unable to recover a recording of the live presentation. This later recording presents virtually the same content, though without the spirited question and answer session that followed. My sincerest thanks and appreciation to the Society of Antiquaries of London and to the Fellows of the Society for hosting this lecture. Some years ago, I submitted a proposal to a certain well-regarded university press for a monograph on Lady Jane Grey Dudley and the English succession crisis of 1553. That press publishes a series devoted exclusively to English monarchs, so it seemed like a logical fit. My proposal was rejected on first sight, however, on the stated grounds that, quote, the inclusion of Jane Grey among the monarchs of England strains the definition of monarch, end quote. I believe, however, that a thorough study of both Jane Grey Dudley and the succession crisis of 1553 provide much needed insight into how English political culture of the Tudor era defined the word monarch and monarchy for itself. I argue that the alteration of the succession away from Mary and Elizabeth Tudor and in favor of Jane Grey Dudley stemmed from adherence to an ancient paradigm that constructed monarch in the English context as exclusively male. That paradigm both reflected and reinforced gender role expectations that excluded females from overt participation in the public sphere. And I further argue that a gender-based analysis of the succession crisis of 1553 resolves the otherwise unresolved scholarly debate on the removal of from the succession of Elizabeth in addition to Mary. One strain of that debate, led in the 1960s by W.K. Jordan, asserts that Edward acted under the dominating influence of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and sought to prevent Roman Catholic Mary from reversing Henry VIII's and Edward VI's religious reforms. The exclusion of nominally reformist Elizabeth is a thorn in the side of that assertion, and Jordan himself conceded that her exclusion was not easily explained. Another strain of the debate blames Dudley entirely for the episode and casts him as a Machiavellian figure bent on the preservation of his own power and of plotting to establish a Dudley royal dynasty. That line of reasoning leaves unanswered, however, the question of why Dudley chose a circuitous route rather than simply retaining Elizabeth as Edward's heir and compelling her to marry his only son Guilford, or even himself, following, of course, a divorce from Mrs. Dudley. Examination of the succession crisis through the lens of gender, however, reveals a single overarching motivation for removing both women from the succession. English political culture generally, and Tudor political culture more specifically, were not equipped with the necessary theoretical underpinnings for accommodating rule vested in a woman, especially an unmarried woman. The prospect of a queen regnant challenged any number of ancient political, religious, social, and cultural gender role constructs. Beginning as far back as the writers of the Old Testament and the ancient Greek philosophers, women were traditionally regarded as inferior beings more prone to sin and temptation than were men. I assume that most of you are familiar with the lengthy history of European patriarchy and the marginalization of women, so please forgive me if I remind you that English women in particular were implicitly or explicitly barred from office in government, in the church, and in the military. They could not serve on juries and could not initiate litigation except under certain limited circumstances. Their ability to own real property was circumscribed by law. Women were instead largely relegated to the private or domestic sphere. But even there, social and religious customs of the period mandated that husbands held dominion over their wives, and wives were subject to their husbands and bound to obey them in all things as masters of the household. and there was no recognized precedent or provision for reversing that hierarchy, even if the wife was a reigning queen. Only one woman, Matilda Fitz-Empress, had ever claimed the English crown, doing so as the eldest surviving daughter of Henry I. But her claim was disputed by Stephen of Blois, and the lengthy conflict that followed is remembered as the Anarchy. Yet when Edward fell ill in February 1553, he was unwed and childless, and the next 9 descendants of Henry VII were all female. The English political establishment faced the certainty in 1553 that the crown would pass to a woman. Edward himself began to address the issue as early as March 1553, but his initial solution was exceedingly impractical, as I will be discussing shortly. His final illness progressed rapidly, so that king and council were compelled to accept a solution unique in English history. Edward and the council sought to elevate to the crown a female who was 4th in the line of succession, Jane Grey Dudley, setting aside Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, as well as Jane's mother, Frances Brandon Grey. The ultimate goal, however, was not simply to make Jane queen, but rather to make her husband Guilford king regnant in right of his wife. The Proclamation of Accession of Queen Jane reflects the existing paradigm situating the husband as head over the wife, and anticipated that the husband of any woman acceding sua jure to the crown would himself assume the reins of power. The proclamation states, quote, "And forasmuch also as it is to be thought, that if the said Lady Mary or Lady Elizabeth should hereafter have and enjoy the said imperial crown of this realm, and should then happen to marry any stranger born out of this realm, that then the same stranger, having the government and imperial crown in his hands, would adhere in practice to the utter subversion of the commonweal of this realm." Though the proclamation does not refer to Jane's husband Guilford in any explicit way, the argument that the husband of a queen sua jure having the government and imperial crown in his hands would seemingly apply to Guilford as well. No documentation survives to provide explicit evidence of a plan to make Guilford king in right of his wife, but an absence of documentation should not be interpreted as acquiescence or even complacency. Too many records from the period failed to survive, both personal records and official ones. Let us examine one other document at the center of the attempt to alter the succession, Edward's own device for the succession. Both W.K. Jordan and David Loades characterized the device as a mere schoolboy exercise, but that is unmerited given the history of Edward's deep involvement in a host of other political issues. I believe Edward, as the living embodiment of his father's obsessive pursuit of a male heir, was as troubled as was his father at the prospect of potentially being succeeded by a woman. He therefore began to work on a solution in late February or early March 1553, producing a series of revisions between then and mid-June. In the original formula for the document, Edward followed the example set by his father's last will and testament, passing over without mention those persons he wished excluded from the succession. These include his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, as well as the entire line of Scottish descendants, both male and female, of his elder aunt Margaret. The only female descendants of his other younger but deceased aunt, Mary Tudor Brandon, remained. Edward viewed them initially as simply producers of male heirs, however, not as heirs themselves. Edward wrote, quote, "For lack of issue of my body, to the Lady Frances's heirs male, for lack of such issue to the Lady Frances's heirs male, to the Lady Jane's heirs male," and so on through 13-year-old Catherine Grey's future sons and 8-year-old Mary Grey's future sons, to the heirs male of Margaret Clifford, daughter of Frances Brandon's deceased younger sister Eleanor. Edward then backtracked and provided for the failure of all those women to provide male issue, in which case the crown was to pass to any son born to a daughter of any of the 4 younger women named. This early form of the draft is startling for its vivid display of Edward's insistence on passing over an entire household of female heirs to reach even the most remote of male heirs. Under the terms of this draft, a grandson of Edward's most distant cousin, Lady Margaret Clifford, would inherit before his nearest cousin, Francis Brandon Grey, even if Margaret's grandson was still an infant. Edward was so thoroughly imbued with the Tudor political cultural preference for male-only royal succession that he was initially and patently unrealistically, utterly unwilling to countenance any female assuming the throne. Item 5 of the device took the exercise even further, however. Were Edward to die without issue and without a male heir having been born to one of the women named, Frances Grey was to be an interregnal governess until such time as she or one of the other women gave birth to a male child, at which time that child's mother would become governess. Any female governess regent was to do nothing without the advice of at least 6 men from a council of 20 to be appointed separately by Edward himself. Clearly, Edward was prepared in theory to accept short-term female rule, even an interregnum headed by a female, but if she were in either case aided and restricted by a male advisory council while awaiting the birth and or the legal majority of a male. He was not prepared to accept an unfettered female monarch. Edward seems even to have struggled with the notion that he might leave only female issue of his own body. In the opening phrase of the document, quote, "for lack of issue of my body," end quote, he inserted the word males above the line so that the phrase became lack of issue male of my body. Edward was apparently prepared to bar even his own daughters from succeeding him. He relented on this point, however, and later removed the gender condition from the phrase. Edward was reluctantly willing to countenance his own daughter as his heir if circumstances required doing so, but his preference was clearly for a male heir from somewhere, anywhere, in the line of his Brandon cousins. As we know, Edward was ultimately forced by the rapid decline in his health to accept a female heir. But he still passed over his first cousin, Francis Brandon Grey. In its final form, the device stipulated that only the heirs male of the Lady Frances, quote, "if she have any such before my death," end quote, should succeed him. Edward's likely reasons for setting Frances aside is beyond the scope of this lecture, but I believe those reasons lay in a poor assessment of Henry Grey as Frances's husband. Failing any male issue coming from Frances, her daughter, the Lady Jane, was to succeed. Edward almost certainly made this final alteration only after Jane's marriage to Guildford on 25th May. And in passing the crown directly to Jane, Edward could perhaps convince himself that Jane would be ably guided and advised by Guildford and Guildford's father, the Duke of Northumberland. I personally believe Edward enabled Jane to succeed him in the very conscious awareness that Guildford would become king in right of his wife, in effect preserving the English monarchy as a male-gendered office. I turn now to the recorded actions of the principal players and to the observations made by eyewitnesses to the events of July 1553 for what they tell us about the unstated goals of Edward and his Privy Council. On Saturday, the 8th of July, the Privy Council wrote to the English ambassador at the imperial court, informing him of the death of the king, but no successor was named. It cannot be known whether that was because no formal public proclamation had yet been made, or because the council lacked confidence in their own plan. But failure to name the new monarch seems to me quite odd. The following day, Sunday the 9th of July, troops within the Tower were required to swear an oath of loyalty, though it is unclear whether the oath was to Jane specifically, as the diarist Henry Machen claims, or to the crown generally, as the imperial ambassadors state. The troops swore a second oath to uphold Edward's device, but it is again unknown whether the troops were informed of the contents of the device. Simultaneously, the Bishop of London, Nicholas Ridley, preached a sermon at St. Paul's in which he denounced both Mary and Elizabeth as unfit for the crown. Like those before him, Ridley did not name a successor, yet we know that he was aware that Jane was to be queen, since he was one of the signatories to Edward's letters patent almost 3 weeks earlier. Even as these events transpired in London, John Dudley and a number of privy councillors embarked from Greenwich and travelled by river barge via the Tower to Zion House, Dudley's suburban London residence recently acquired from the attainted Lord Protector Somerset. The party rode past the Grey residence at Sheen Priory without stopping to collect the new queen, who was in residence there. This is a remarkable act, perhaps even unprecedented in English accession history. On the day of Henry VIII's death in January 1547, for example, young Edward was at Hertford, and the council immediately dispatched representatives to Hertford to fetch the new king to London. The council under John Dudley had no such plan in July 1553, perhaps because Guildford was likely at his father's side and fully informed of events, though there is no reference whatsoever to Guildford's whereabouts between the death of the king on the 6th and the public proclamation on the 10th of July of Jane's accession. But with Guildford presumably already present at Zion House, the council took the astonishing step of summoning the new queen to attend upon them, making it quite clear that their focus lay somewhere other than Jane. Dudley and the council had effectively ignored the existence of Jane until such time as they were absolutely required to acknowledge her. The following day, Monday the 10th of July, the French ambassadors wrote letter to the French King Henri II in which they repeatedly referred to, quote, le nouveau roi, not la reine. The Spanish and imperial ambassadors similarly referred to the new king and queen in their own letters. One of Emperor Charles V's counselors, Don Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, met with Philip Hoby in Brussels on the 15th, and Hoby immediately reported home to London that Don Diego, quote, could not but at one time both sorrow with us for the loss of our old master, and also rejoice with us that our master which is departed did, ere he went, provide us of a king in whom we had so much cause to rejoice. We take him for your king, which the consent of the nobles of your country have allowed for your king. I, for my part, of all others, am bound to be glad that his majesty is set in this office. I was his godfather, and would as willingly spend my blood in his service as any subject he hath. End quote. Hoby gave no indication of having corrected Don Diego, perhaps because Hoby likewise assumed that Guildford would be king. Lastly, in regard to Guildford, the Spanish and imperial ambassadors afterward recounted Guildford's personal insistence on being addressed as Your Grace, a common 16th century form of address for the English monarch, that he had sat at the head of the table during meetings of the Privy Council, and that he had dined alone in state like a monarch. None of these things would have happened in the absence of a general understanding that Guildford was king de facto. Others of Guildford's actions similarly indicate that he understood that he was to be king. In contemporaneous letters written by an Italian in London, and that I discovered a few years ago quite by chance through a simple Google search, the anonymous writer states, quote, the husband stood with hat in hand, not only in front of the queen, but in front of his father and mother, all the other lords making a show of themselves, putting the knee on the ground, end quote. Guildford was allowed to assume a physical position that signaled his precedence over and above that of his wife, the Queen, indicating an understanding by the core participants in the pageant that he was to supersede his wife politically. And if, as the author implies, all the other lords kneeled before Guildford as well as before the Queen, it must be concluded that those lords understood Guildford to be the new king, even if he was not yet publicly proclaimed as such. It is quite possible that the specific staging of the entry, the physical placement or blocking of the participants, was deliberately calculated to gauge the opinion of the observing public. Dudley was a skilled politician and had reportedly taken steps on more than one occasion to assess the public's most likely responses to his and the Privy Council's pending plans. Ambassador Scaife had previously reported on 10th April, for example, that Dudley deliberately circulated a rumor regarding a planned seizure of church property, quote, in order to ascertain the opinion of the public and what inferences and conclusions might be drawn therefrom, end quote. Again, on 12th of May, Scaife reported that a rumor of improvement in the king's health was being spread, quote, to appease the people who were disturbed, end quote. The nature of this latter rumor suggests that it too originated with Dudley and the Privy Council in the pursuit of public calm. Thus, given that Dudley and the Council were at least somewhat cognizant of the role played in political affairs by public opinion, it is logical to conclude that Guildford was placed in a conspicuous position during the pageantry of the entry into the Tower to gauge how the public might respond to the prospect of a King Guildford. The traditional public ceremony of the proclamation throughout the city of the accession of a new monarch began shortly after the ceremonial entry and after a cannon salute was completed. The salute alerted the population of London to the occurrence of some significant event, and the populace would no doubt have been curious to learn what a great occurrence had transpired. Two herald kings-at-arms from the College of Arms, accompanied by trumpeters, the Sheriff of London, Sir William Garrard, and the small body of the sheriff's men, passed from Cheapside to Fleet Street, announcing the death of King Edward VI and the accession of Queen Jane. And even as the heralds were making their way around the city of London to proclaim Queen Jane, the council took the additional step of ordering the proclamation to be printed for distribution by Richard Grafton, the king's printer during Edward's reign, and a long-standing proponent of religious reform. This was only the second printed proclamation of accession issued in English history, and a number of copies and near-contemporary transcriptions have survived. The document is an extraordinarily lengthy one of over 1,700 words. The issuance of a lengthy and printed defense of Jane's right to the throne is itself an indicator of the Privy Council's collectively anxious state of mind, suggesting that they felt the need to do more than simply announce Jane's accession in the traditional manner. They instead felt compelled to issue a printed public defense for the setting aside of Mary and Elizabeth, doing so using a complex three-pronged argument. The proclamation began by declaring the styles and titles of the new queen. Jane, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith and of the Church of England and also of Ireland, under Christ in earth, supreme head. The proclamation then rehearsed the circumstances and content of the letters patent derived from Edward's device. The approval and subscription of, quote, the most part of the nobles, the council, and the law judges, and, quote, divers other grave and sage personages, received particular notice. Such notice conveyed to the populace that a majority of the political elite had judged the change in the succession to be necessary and had acted lawfully, rather than being the result of a coup d'etat by a minority. The familiar stipulations of the Act for the Succession of 1544 were enumerated, followed immediately by a reminder that the ladies Mary and Elizabeth were both illegitimate owing to the divorces obtained by Henry VIII from their respective mothers. Their illegitimacy had, quote, been severally ratified and confirmed by authority of Parliament, end quote, in 1536, and that act, quote, remained in force, strength, and effect, whereby as well the said Lady Mary as also the said Lady Elizabeth, to all intents and purposes, are and been clearly disabled to ask, claim, or challenge the said imperial crown or any other of the honors, castles, manors, lordships, or lands as heir or heirs to our said late cousin King Edward VI, or as heir or heirs to any other person or persons whatsoever. The implicit assumption of this argument was grounded in the still somewhat nascent concept that the monarch was subject to the will of the people as expressed through Parliament, as well as to the common law. Mary and Elizabeth had been rendered illegitimate by their respective mothers' divorces or annulments, and their illegitimacy had been further codified by Acts of Parliament in 1533 and 1536. Under English common law, illegitimate persons were barred from inheriting real property, and the crown entailed real property. The Act for the Succession of 1544 had restored Mary and Elizabeth to the royal succession, but it did so without explicitly repealing the bastardy clauses of the Acts of 1533 and 1536. The unstated question that Jane's proclamation sought to answer preemptively was whether the Act of 1544 could rightly restore Mary and Elizabeth's right to succeed to the crown without first expressly relegitimating them. Jane's proclamation of accession argued that it could not, and the ladies Mary and Elizabeth were therefore ineligible to succeed their half-brother. In case this first layer of argument was insufficient or unconvincing, the proclamation added a second layer. Even if Mary and Elizabeth were considered ineligible to inherit property despite the Acts of Parliament rendering them illegitimate, even if Mary and Elizabeth were considered eligible to inherit property despite the Acts of Parliament rendering them illegitimate, the proclamation argued they were nonetheless ineligible on other grounds. Mary and Elizabeth were, quote, but of the half-blood, end quote, a confusing concept for any but specialist legal historians. According to, quote, ancient laws, statutes, and customs of the realm, end quote, collateral heirs of the half-blood were barred from inheriting from a lineal heir of the whole blood, even a very distant one, a legal hardship that would remain unaltered in England until 1833. Jane and her mother Frances were both lineal heirs of the whole blood, so that, according to feudal custom and common law, their claims superseded those of Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom were collateral heirs of the half-blood. Or so the proclamation argued. Parenthetically, the common law stipulated that Mary and Elizabeth, as half-blood siblings of Elizabeth, could inherit, but only after the whole blood line descended from Mary Tudor Brandon was exhausted. A third layer, unrelated to issues of inheritance, was then added for good measure, one that sought to exploit English xenophobia by raising the specter of foreign domination of the realm. The proclamation noted that both Mary and Elizabeth were presently unmarried. If, upon coming to the throne, they should, quote, then happen to marry with any stranger born out of this realm, end quote, that foreign-born husband would have, quote, the government and the imperial crown in his hands, end quote. Since English conceptualizations of gender roles rendered wives almost entirely subject to the will of their husbands, and English law gave husbands title to and control over their wives' property, the proclamation and its framers assumed that the husband of any woman inheriting the crown would himself become controller and even wearer of the crown. In the cases of Mary and Elizabeth, foreign marriages were believed more likely than domestic ones. Either woman's putative foreign husband would then have the laws and customs of his or their own native country or countries to be practiced and put in use within this realm, supplanting cherished English law and custom and bringing England, like the Low Countries, under the domination of a foreign power. Despite the absence of any direct mention of religious qualification in Edwards' device, religion did figure indirectly in the proclamation of Jane's accession. In what was perhaps a concession to the realities of conservative popular religious belief within England so early in the Reformation, the proclamation noted that any foreign husband of Mary and Elizabeth would, quote, bring this noble free realm into the tyranny and servitude of the Bishop of Rome, end quote. Issues of doctrine were notably absent, however. The focus fell instead on the prospect of domination by a foreign power over a large part of both English religious and cultural practice as well as English law. If surrendering to a foreign bishop entailed a return to papal control over the English Church, papal control entailed in its turn the surrendering to foreign hands of control over church courts, which still provided a significant portion of the justice meted out in 16th century England. Jane, on the other hand, promised through her proclamation to retain in English hands all control over the English Church and to, quote, preserve and maintain God's most holy word, Christian policy, and the good laws, customs, and liberties of these our realms and dominions." End quote. England's religious destiny would be determined under Queen Jane by loyal Englishmen rather than by strangers and foreigners. The Proclamation of Accession made no mention of Guildford, since no official act had yet been taken to elevate him to the crown matrimonial. But many Londoners would have been aware of the couple's recent nuptial celebrations at Durham House, and some had witnessed the prominent role played by Guildford during the ceremonial entry into the Tower earlier that afternoon. Whether witnesses to the proclamation yet comprehended any underlying plan for Jane to share her throne with Guildford cannot to date be known. But the manner in which the proclamation addressed the potential for a foreign husband of a ruling Queen of England to subvert the realm indicates that, at minimum, the council expected the populace to connect the proverbial dots of this third argument until such time as Guildford could be officially elevated to the royal dignity. The proclamation then offered a considerable discourse on Tudor genealogy, with pointed notice as to how carefully Edward had weighed the options. It declared that the Lady Jane, lawfully born daughter of the Lady Frances, was Edward's nominee to inherit the crown and had now assumed the same. The proclamation ended with a declaration reputedly emanating from Queen Jane herself. Quote, "We do therefore by these presents signify unto all our most loving, faithful, and obedient subjects, that like as we are for our part shall, by God's grace, show ourselves a most gracious and benign sovereign Queen and Lady to all our good subjects in all their just and lawful suits and causes, and to the uttermost of our power shall preserve and maintain God's most holy word, Christian policy, and the good laws, customs, and liberties of these our realms and dominions. So we mistrust not, but that they and every of them will again for their parts, at all times and all cases, show themselves unto us, their natural liege, queen, and lady, most faithful, loving, and obedient subjects, according to their bounden duties and allegiances, whereby they shall please God and do the thing that shall tend to their own preservations and sureties." The response to the proclamation was at best muted. According to the Spanish observers, themselves biased in support of the Roman Catholic Mary, quote, "No one present showed any sign of rejoicing, and no one cried, 'Long live the Queen,' except the herald who made the proclamation and a few archers who followed him." End quote. I'm compelled to wonder to what extent the significant apathy towards John Dudley and the resistance to the alteration of the succession was motivated by a profound lack of enthusiasm for the prospect of a King Guildford. Both Henry VII and his son Henry VIII had succeeded in so thoroughly eliminating potential rival claimants to their respective thrones that it would be difficult in 1553 to find a male heir of suitably royal blood within England. Only female heirs remained, but Edward and the English political establishment refused initially to accept that reality. They collectively determined that the most suitable way to ensure, in the circumstances, that England would be ruled by a king rather than by a queen, was to nominate a woman who was unarguably legitimately born, who was already married, and whose husband was both suitably English and judged competent to rule. Jane Grey Dudley was the only woman who fit those criteria. The alteration of the succession in 1553 was a first faltering attempt at adaptation to monarchy vested in a woman. The alteration was, in essence, a failed first experiment in what would become a series of experiments. First, three very different women each inherited the crown, one from the other in succession, and each responded differently to the Tudor English preference for a male monarch. The issue resolved in 1603 upon the accession of James VI and I, but it arose again in 1688 when William III and Mary II were proclaimed co-monarchs. And following another long gap, the issue arose once more in relation to Queen Victoria with the question of what power and privileges she would be accorded to her husband Prince Albert. More recently, the same reportedly arose regarding Prince Philip's status relative to his wife Queen Elizabeth II. The issue was seemingly finally resolved, however, just 12 years ago, fully 460 years after the accession of Queen Jane, with the passage of the Succession Act of 2013 that finally removed gender as a consideration in the royal succession. My sincerest thanks and appreciation again to the Society of Antiquaries of London and to the Fellows of the Society for hosting